discover the extraordinary tale of Mariela, a young maid whose silent acts of kindness, fresh flowers on a grieving widow's doorstep, begin to heal the heart of the reclusive Mrs. Alma Moreno. As Mariela's own world crumbles under the weight of poverty and her mother's illness, her anonymous gifts ignite a spark of hope in the widow's desolate life. But when Mariela vanishes without a trace, the stage is set for an unexpected revelation. Will Mrs. Moreno uncover the identity of her mysterious benefactor? Can these two women, separated by class but united by compassion, change each other's destinies forever? Dive into this emotional journey to find out. The maid arrived just before sunrise, when the grand house sat cloaked in silence and shadows. Mariela had always preferred the quiet hours. No one noticed her then. The vast, cold halls of the Moreno estate had an emptiness about them, one that mirrored the grieving widow who lived inside. Mariela moved quickly, carrying her small burlap sack and an old basket with handles worn smooth. She wore a hand-sewn uniform that hung loose on her slender frame, her shoes scuffed and damp from the morning dew. A year had passed since Mr. Moreno's death, but the house felt like he had just walked out for air. Every clock was frozen at the same hour, 6:23, the time the doctors declared him gone. The widow, Mrs. Alma Moreno, remained behind locked doors, where the curtains never parted and footsteps were scarce. Don't linger, the older staff warned Mariela. She doesn't want to be seen, and neither do you. But Mariela lingered anyway. She didn't mean to pry, but she couldn't ignore what her eyes saw. The untouched food trays left outside the widow's room. The old white lilies, brown and curling in the vases. The letters, unopened and dusting over. Grief had consumed the grand lady of the house, like ivy strangling a stone facade. The servants gossiped, "She's lost her mind," or "She'll never recover." But Mariela didn't see madness. She saw loneliness, a hollow so vast it seemed to echo through every inch of that house. And Mariela knew loneliness well. She was 16, the daughter of a seamstress, both thrust into service work when Mariela's father died. Her mother barely earned enough to keep a leaky room in the city, and Mariela sent every cent she made to help her. Each month brought new fears. Would they eat? Would they be evicted? It would have been easier to harden herself, to keep her head down like the others. But Mariela had always carried a soft heart, one that noticed wilting flowers, empty rooms, and the kind of quiet that felt heavier than noise. On that first quiet morning, something compelled her. She removed the dead lilies, slipping out to the garden and snipping new bloom. She arranged them in the crystal vase so that they were fresh and full of life. Mrs. Moreno never saw her do it. No one did. That was the first day Mariela left her small, invisible mark on the house. Time passed. Mariela tended to her duties as expected, but she began leaving other small gestures behind. A note tucked between pages of Mrs. Moreno's untouched books. The sun rises, even when we cannot see it. A simple, hopeful sentence. Another day, she folded a wool blanket over the velvet chair outside the widow's room, where faint whispers of cold always crept through the cracks. She never signed her name, never waited for thanks. She didn't throw the flowers out this time, Mariela told herself one day, an unexpected warmth in her chest. She noticed the widow had moved them, just slightly closer to the light. Mariela's small kindnesses continued, and though she received no word of acknowledgement, her hope deepened. Maybe something was shifting. But life in the servants' quarters remained hard. Her wages barely stretched far enough. The other servants teased her sometimes. "Dreaming, are you? What's kindness ever gotten someone like us?" one of the housemaids asked, laughing bitterly. Mariela didn't answer. She only smiled faintly, though her eyes carried a shadow of doubt. The truth was, kindness had cost Mariela dearly in the past. Her mother often said, "You care too much, Mariela. People will take from you and leave you empty." Mariela wanted to believe kindness could be different, that it could bring light where there was none. But doubt lingered, just as hunger did. One evening, the house fell into chaos. A rare visitor, a lawyer, had arrived to meet Mrs. Moreno. News swept through the staff like wildfire. "She's selling the estate. The house is crumbling under her grief. She'll go to the city and leave us all behind." Mariela didn't know why the thought crushed her, but it did. Would Mrs. Moreno disappear too? Would her quiet kindnesses go unnoticed, as though they'd never happened at all? The staff speculated in whispers. She'll never recover, they said. We'll all lose our jobs. What happens to us then? The next morning, Mariela walked past the widow's door, pausing when she noticed something strange. The blanket she'd placed outside the room weeks ago, unused and forgotten, was gone. Her breath caught. Then she saw it. The faintest outline of a figure sitting by the window, wrapped in the wool. Alma Moreno, silhouetted in the fragile dawn. Mariela stepped back before she was seen, her heart pounding. It was nothing, just a woman sitting. But to Mariela, it was everything. She's seeing the light, but no story flows without the harsh hand of reality. Mariela returned home weeks later to find her mother ill, fevered and frail. The doctor shook his head, scribbling a prescription Mariela couldn't afford. "How much do you need?" one of the servants asked when she confided in her small circle. "Too much," she whispered, wringing her hands. "I don't know what I'll do." Mariela had always believed in kindness, but kindness wasn't a currency you could trade for medicine. Her small gestures at the Moreno house had felt like planting seeds. But what if they never bloomed? What if they meant nothing? As the days stretched on, Mariela moved through the house with a leaden heart. The curtains in Mrs. Moreno's room remained open now, but it wasn't enough. "It's not enough," Mariela thought bitterly, staring at her rough, empty hands. And then, one day, a summons came. Mariela froze when the butler handed her the sealed envelope, his mouth twisting. "Strange. Mrs. Moreno requests your presence." "My presence?" Mariela's voice quivered. "Don't ask questions," he muttered. She followed the butler upstairs, her hands trembling against her apron. For the first time, she would enter the widow's chambers. Do you think Mariela's kindness will change Mrs. Moreno's life? What will happen behind those closed doors? The door to Mrs. Moreno's chambers was heavier than Mariela imagined. It groaned softly as the butler pushed it open, revealing a room soaked in muted light. Dust danced lazily in the sunbeams, settling over velvet furniture and gilded edges. Mariela hesitated on the threshold, her shoes scuffing the polished floor. "Go on," the butler muttered, his tone clipped but curious. Inside, Mrs. Moreno sat by the tall window, her figure framed against the gray sky beyond. She was smaller than Mariela expected, shrunken beneath layers of shawls and silks. Her dark hair, streaked with silver, was pinned back loosely. Her hands, frail but elegant, rested on the arms of her chair. Beside her sat the crystal vase, filled with the lilies Mariela had replaced days before. The widow didn't turn, though her voice cut through the silence. "You've been leaving things." Mariela froze. Her heartbeat quickened as she searched for words, but they wouldn't come. Mrs. Moreno's head tilted slightly, her voice soft but pointed. "The flowers, the notes, that blanket." She turned then, just enough for Mariela to see her face. Dark, tired eyes met hers, unreadable and heavy with something Mariela couldn't name. "Was it you?" Mariela swallowed hard. "Yes," she whispered, bracing for rebuke. But the widow said nothing. Instead, her gaze drifted to the lilies, her fingers tracing the edge of the chair. For a long moment, the room was filled with nothing but the distant sound of ticking clocks. "Why?" Mrs. Moreno asked finally, the word catching like a splinter. Mariela stared at the floor. She wanted to say something beautiful, something that would explain the ache she felt seeing the house and the woman inside, so lifeless. But all that came out was the truth. "Because I couldn't help it." The widow's gaze sharpened, but she didn't speak. Mariela stood there, uncertain, feeling suddenly small and foolish. "You've overstepped," she thought bitterly. "What were you thinking?" "I'll leave now, ma'am," Mariela said quickly, bowing her head. "No." The single word froze her mid-step. "I didn't ask you to leave." Mrs. Moreno's voice wavered, softened. Her eyes lingered on the lilies. "They're fresh," she murmured, almost to herself. "I forgot what fresh flowers smelled like." Mariela glanced up cautiously. There was something in the widow's face, cracks in the stone, faint but undeniable. "Sit," Mrs. Moreno said, gesturing to the chair opposite her. Mariela hesitated. "Ma'am, I insist." For weeks, Mariela's life shifted in ways she hadn't thought possible. Each morning, Mrs. Moreno called for her. Sometimes they sat in silence, the widow gazing out the window while Mariela fidgeted with her apron. Other days, Alma asked strange questions. "Why do you work here? A girl like you?" "My family needs the money," Mariela replied honestly. "We've always worked. You remind me of someone," Alma said once, though she didn't explain who. Slowly, Mrs. Moreno began to change. The curtains that had remained closed for months were opened wider. The untouched books on the shelves were removed, dusted, and opened. Some days, Alma asked Mariela to read to her. Old poetry about love and loss, tales that made her eyes glisten though she never let tears fall. Mariela's small gestures continued, but now, Mrs. Moreno noticed, a scarf draped over her shoulders on colder mornings, a cup of warm tea, prepared just the way she liked. It was as if Mariela's invisible hands had become seen. "Do you believe in second chances, Mariela?" Alma asked one morning, her voice soft but distant. Mariela paused, glancing up from the teacup she'd been refilling. "I don't know, ma'am. I suppose I hope for them." Mrs. Moreno didn't reply. She only stared out at the garden. But outside those chambers, Mariela's life grew harder. Her mother's illness worsened, and Mariela's wages stretched thin. She stopped eating most nights, sending all she could home. Exhaustion weighed on her, turning her steps heavy and slow. "Are you unwell?" Mrs. Moreno asked one day, eyeing her closely. "No, ma'am," Mariela lied, forcing a smile. The widow studied her a moment longer before turning away. "I hate liars," she murmured, though there was no bite to the word. The next morning, a letter arrived at the estate. Mariela had been summoned back to her boarding room by the caretaker of her tenement. Her mother's condition had turned critical, and the doctor's visits had run out. Mariela's hands shook as she stuffed her few belongings into a threadbare sack. "You're leaving?" one of the kitchen maids asked, watching her with pity. "What about Mrs. Moreno?" "She'll be fine without me," Mariela said softly, though the words felt like thorns. As she left, the house loomed behind her, a grand, hollow place she hadn't realized she'd grown attached to. Mariela returned to the crumbling building she called home. Her mother's frail form seemed even smaller beneath the thin blankets. Mariela sat beside her, clutching her hands as tears slid silently down her face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I've tried, Mama." Her mother's lips moved faintly, but no sound came. Mariela stared at the ceiling, feeling something inside her splinter. I couldn't save her. I couldn't save anything. Back at the Moreno estate, the servants murmured of the girl's disappearance. No one knew the full truth. Inside her chambers, Alma Moreno sat by the window, staring at the empty chair across from her. The vase of lilies had begun to wilt, petals drooping in the light. She glanced at the small pile of notes stacked on her desk. Ones Mariela had slipped between books. She picked up the first one and read the words aloud softly. "The sun rises even when we cannot see it." For the first time in years, Alma wept. What will happen now that Mariela has left? Will Mrs. Moreno seek her out, or has their fragile connection been broken forever? The tenement room smelled of dampness and desperation. Mariela sat motionless beside her mother, her hands raw from holding on to fragile hope. A small, flickering candle on the bedside table cast soft shadows across the crumbling walls. Her mother's breaths came slow and shallow, each one a ragged reminder of how much time had slipped through their fingers. "I'll find a way, Mama," Mariela whispered, though even her voice cracked with doubt. She clutched the doctor's prescription, crumpled now, a cruel piece of paper that felt heavier than her world. There was no way. Her mother stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering open just enough to see her daughter. "Mariela," she murmured, the faintest whisper of a voice. "Why are you crying?" Mariela shook her head, forcing a trembling smile. "I'm not. Don't worry. Just rest." A small, brittle laugh left her mother's lips. "You always worried for others more than yourself." She paused, coughing, the sound rattling. "Always too kind, my girl." Mariela felt her throat close. Kindness doesn't matter now, she thought bitterly, though the words tore at her. Her mother's eyes drifted closed again. Mariela sat there, cradling her mother's hand, her thoughts spiraling into helplessness. There must be something. A soft knock echoed at the door. Mariela didn't move at first, staring blankly ahead. But the knock came again, louder, urgent. "Who is it?" she called, her voice hoarse. "It's from the Moreno estate," a gruff male voice replied. "Open the door." Mariela blinked, her heart lurching. She stumbled to her feet, wiping her face before unlocking the door. Standing in the dim hallway was Mr. Rivera, the butler, clutching a sealed envelope. He looked as stern as ever, though there was something different in his expression. "Take this," he said, shoving the letter toward her. "What is it?" Mariela asked, bewildered. "Instructions," Mr. Rivera said, his voice clipped but careful. "Mrs. Moreno wants you back, immediately." "I can't," Mariela started, panic welling in her chest. "My mother, I was told to deliver this no matter what," Rivera interrupted. "And to say," he hesitated, as though the words were not his own, "to say you were not forgotten." Mariela stared at him, confusion clouding her face. "Read the letter," he said, his voice softening. He turned to leave, his heavy steps echoing down the hallway. Mariela's hands trembled as she broke the wax seal. Inside was a short handwritten note on the same fine stationery Mrs. Moreno always used. "Mariela, I owe a debt I can never repay. Come to the house tonight. Bring your mother. Alma Moreno." Mariela read the words over and over as if they might change. "Bring your mother." Hours later, a carriage, black and glossy with shining lanterns, pulled up outside the crumbling tenement. For the first time in her life, Mariela and her mother rode in something grander than a cart. The cobbled streets rolled beneath them as they approached the Moreno estate, its sprawling silhouette towering against the moonlit sky. Mariela couldn't speak, her hands clutching her mother's frail form as she drifted in and out of consciousness. "Hold on, Mama," she whispered desperately. "We're almost there." The gates to the estate creaked open, and the carriage rolled to a stop before the wide marble steps. Light spilled from the windows, glowing golden and warm, as if the house itself had woken from a long sleep. Two servants rushed out to meet them, lifting Mariela's mother carefully from the carriage. "This way," one of them said, his voice hurried but gentle. "We've prepared a room." Mariela stumbled after them, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Why? Why is she doing this?" she asked breathlessly. "She'll explain," the servant replied. Mrs. Moreno stood in the grand foyer, waiting. The chandeliers burned brightly above her, casting soft light over her sharp features. She looked regal in black velvet, though her eyes held something different now, softer, as though a veil had been lifted. Mariela approached her slowly, shaking from exhaustion and disbelief. "You—" Mrs. Moreno lifted a hand. "Not here," she said firmly. "Your mother will be cared for first." They led Mariela to a warm, clean room where a doctor waited with medicines she didn't recognize. Her mother was placed gently in the bed, already breathing easier as the doctor murmured instructions to the waiting nurses. Mariela sank into a chair beside her mother, unable to process what was happening. The room smelled of lavender, the linens smooth and fresh. She couldn't stop staring at her mother's face, peaceful now, no longer twisted in pain. "You saved her," Mariela whispered, tears falling freely. Hours later, as the night stretched thin, Mrs. Moreno summoned Mariela to the library. The room was grand and rich, with the scent of old books and wood polish. Alma sat by the fireplace, the flames casting shadows across her face. "Sit," she said quietly. Mariela obeyed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a long moment, Mrs. Moreno said nothing. Then finally she spoke. "You left me lilies," she began softly, "and notes that reminded me the sun still rises, blankets when I was cold, tea when I didn't ask for it. Do you know what you did?" Mariela shook her head, her voice catching. You saved me," Mrs. Moreno said, her voice steady but raw. "When I believed no one could. You were a stranger, a maid, invisible to the world, and yet you saw me when no one else did." Mariela's eyes filled again, but she couldn't speak. "I have been alone a long time, Mariela," Alma continued, her gaze far away. "But kindness, your kindness, was a rope I didn't know I was clinging to." She paused, her lips trembling. "And now I will repay that kindness." Mariela's breath hitched. "I don't understand." Mrs. Moreno leaned forward, her voice firm. "Your mother will have the best care this city can offer. You will never worry for her again. And as for you, Mariela blinked, her heart pounding. You will no longer be a maid in this house, Alma said, her dark eyes glistening. You are more than that. Mariela stared at her, stunned. But why? Alma smiled faintly, a ghost of warmth breaking through her stern features. Because, my dear girl, kindness is not forgotten, and neither are you. The days that followed felt like a waking dream for Mariela. Her mother's room, bright and filled with life, hummed with quiet activity. The doctor visited daily, leaving behind bottles of medicine and soft assurances. Mariela watched in awe as color slowly returned to her mother's cheeks, the deep furrow of pain easing from her brow. You look better, Mama, Mariela whispered one afternoon, brushing strands of hair from her mother's face. Her mother smiled faintly, reaching for Mariela's hand. And you look so much older, my girl. Her voice, though still frail, held the faint trace of teasing warmth Mariela had missed. Mariela blinked back tears, squeezing her mother's hand tightly. The Moreno estate, once shrouded in gloom, began to change as well. Servants whispered about it behind closed doors, marveling at the strange transformation of the house and its mistress. The curtains are open in every room. Have you seen her? Mrs. Moreno walks the garden now, every morning. But the greatest murmur of all came when invitations were delivered, gilded and embossed with Alma Moreno's crest. A gala? The servants gasped, holding the ornate envelopes as if they might burst into flames. For charity? She hasn't hosted anyone in years. When Mariela heard the news, she was shocked. It had been weeks since that fateful night when Mrs. Moreno summoned her, and although their bond had deepened, Alma teaching her to read the ledgers, to walk through the house like something more than a servant, this was different. What is it for? Mariela asked Alma one evening, watching the widow arrange a stack of crisp invitations. To honor someone, Alma replied quietly, a mysterious smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Someone who saved me when I didn't know I needed saving. Mariela frowned. Who is it? You'll see, Alma said, and her eyes held that knowing glint Mariela couldn't unravel. The night of the gala arrived like a storm. The estate, once cloaked in shadows, glowed with golden light spilling from every window. Carriages lined the drive, their wheels crunching on gravel as they delivered finely dressed men and women who stepped out in glittering gowns and tailored suits. Music, a soft waltz, drifted through the open doors, mingling with the laughter of guests. Mariela had never seen anything like it. From her small room, her new room, with a window that overlooked the garden, she stood, brushing her calloused hands against the simple but beautiful dress she wore. It was Alma who had given it to her, insisting, "You belong here." But even as Mariela stepped into the hallway, nerves twisted in her chest. "I don't belong," she thought. "I'm still just a maid." "Mariela," came a voice. She turned to see Alma standing at the foot of the staircase, dressed in midnight blue, her silver hair braided elegantly. "Come," Mariela hesitated. "But the guests, I don't, trust me." Alma extended her hand, firm but patient. "Please." Mariela swallowed hard before finally stepping forward. Alma's hand wrapped around hers, and together they descended the grand staircase. The ballroom silenced as they entered. Conversations died, and heads turned. Mariela felt their stares, sharp, questioning, but Alma held her hand tightly, her posture regal and unyielding. At the far end of the ballroom stood a platform, where a microphone gleamed in the light. Alma led Mariela through the crowd, murmurs rippling like waves around them. Mariela's cheeks burned, but she kept walking, guided by Alma's steady presence. When they reached the stage, Alma turned to face the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and commanding, "tonight is not a celebration of wealth or status. It is a celebration of kindness, of second chances, and the quiet, unseen acts that save lives." Mariela blinked, her heart pounding. Alma continued, her dark eyes sweeping over the crowd. "There was a time not long ago when I was lost, when grief consumed me, and I believed nothing could lift me from the darkness." She paused, her gaze softening as she turned toward Mariela. "But someone did." The crowd stilled further. "She was a stranger then," Alma said, her voice trembling slightly. "A maid." young, invisible to the world, yet filled with a light I couldn't see. She left flowers when the ones I clung to died. She left words when I had none of my own. She wrapped me in warmth when I felt nothing but cold. I never knew her name, but her kindness saved me. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mariela's breath caught as Alma turned fully toward her, her hands reaching out. "I know her name now," Alma said, her voice breaking just enough to stir tears in every guest's eyes. "It is Mariela." Mariela froze, every muscle in her body refusing to move. Alma smiled faintly, tears glistening in her eyes. Kindness changes lives, and tonight I honor the girl who saved mine. The crowd erupted into applause, thunderous, endless applause. Mariela shook her head, overwhelmed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. "Yes, you do," Alma said softly, pulling her into an embrace. "You always did." Mariela's life transformed after that night, though she remained who she had always been, kind, humble, unwavering. Alma Moreno adopted her into her care, teaching her not just how to manage the estate, but how to dream beyond it. Her mother recovered fully, moving into a small, sunlit cottage on the estate grounds where flowers bloomed year-round. "You've given us a miracle," her mother whispered one day, holding Mariela's hands. "No," Mariela replied, smiling softly. "I was just kind." Years later, the Moreno estate was known not just for its wealth, but for its heart. Mariela, no longer invisible, became its steward, dedicating herself to helping others the way she once helped Alma, quietly and without expectation. And every morning, Alma Moreno placed fresh lilies in the grand hall, a silent tribute to the girl who reminded her that even when unseen, kindness blooms. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment sharing your thoughts and moments that moved you most. Remember, kindness, no matter how small, can change someone's life. Subscribe to HeroKind Stories for more emotional tales that inspire hope and connection.